HowExpert! Top 10 miniature figure painting tips. HowExpert publishes quick how-to guides on all topics from A to Z by everyday experts. Visit HowExpert.com to learn more. Moving on, let's talk about HowExpert Top 10 Miniature Figure Painting Tips. 10. Make sure you have some decent brushes and paints. It's probably clear to anyone that the most important aspect of painting is having the right tools, such as paintbrushes and paints. But it is important to have high-quality tools to get high-quality paint jobs for your minis. For a good paint job, the most important brushes to have are a medium-sized round brush, a smaller round brush, a thin detail brush, and a larger brush. These brushes will be used for base coating, detailing, and highlighting fine detail work and dry brushing, respectively. For paints, the most common type of paint for miniatures are acrylic paints. It is recommended to use acrylic paints designed for miniature painting, as these paints tend to flow better, have less pigments, and dry smoother for a more ideal application. Some companies that specialize in these paints include Vallejo, Citadel, and the Army Painter. It is also recommended to pick paints that come in dropper bottles, although this is purely a personal preference. 9. Clean up your mini before painting. Once the components of your mini have been removed from the sprue, make sure you use a hobby knife or file. Once the components of your mini have been removed from the sprue, make sure you use a putty knife or a file to remove any mold lines. They may not seem like a big deal, but certain paint techniques can bring attention to these lines, which may ruin the look of your model. If your miniature has guns, it may be of interest to drill the gun barrels using a pin vise. This is purely optional but recommended. This will make the guns look much more realistic and add another layer of realism to your beloved miniatures. After all, you will probably spend countless hours painting your minis, so you probably want them to look as nice as possible. 8. Prime the mini. This is another crucial step. It's a common mistake to apply paint directly to a miniature without priming it. Doing this will result in a spotty application that will chip off at the slightest touch. Instead, you should be using primer to give your miniature a flat base coat, which will allow the acrylic paints to adhere to. The most common primer colors to use are white, black, or gray. You may want to choose the right primer color depending on the color scheme. Spray primer is the most common type of primer to use and will be referenced here. The best way of applying primer is to pass your spray can across the miniature in very light, thin passes. It will require several coats of primer to get full coverage, but the main purpose of priming this was to ensure that you don't over-prime the mini, which could result in the coverage of finer details. You want to make sure you preserve all the details in your mini. 7. Use a wet palette. Now we're finally getting to the painting portion of this guide. A wet palette is a key tool for painting, as it's going to keep your acrylic paints moist and prevent them from drying up over long periods of time. This is important as acrylic paints are prone to drying up, making it difficult to properly apply paint. A wet palette is also a key tool for advanced paint application techniques, such as wet blending and paint mixing. But now, how do we get a wet palette? Wet palettes can be bought in hobby stores, but did you know you can also make your own? All you need is a plastic container with a sealed lid, a sponge or absorbent paper towels, and some parchment paper. Soak the sponge or paper towel with water and then place it at the bottom of the container. Then, cut out a piece of parchment paper that is approximately the size of the base of the container and place it over the wet sponge or paper. The parchment paper will promptly become saturated with moisture, and after that you can start using it by placing drops of paint onto it. 6. Thin your paints. Nothing ruins a miniature more than thick globs of paint. You can avoid this by thinning down your paints. Thinning paints is an easy thing to do, but a little difficult to master. The basic process is to add some thinning agent to your paint on your palette, and then mix it in. Water is a sufficient thinning agent, especially since it's commonly available, although specialized thinning agents are available in hobby shops. Once you have applied 1 part thinner to 1 part paint on your palette, mix it together until the paint is the consistency of milk. It should not be super watery or runny, and if it is, you can add more paint to it. Thinned paints dry smoothly, but are more translucent, so it's important to add multiple thin coats. 5. Follow a base coat shade highlight routine. The most basic method of painting minis is by doing the following method. Apply a base coat, then some shade, and then apply highlights. The base coat is done to apply the major colors of your miniature. For example, if your mini has mostly red armor and silver weapons, you would apply coats of red to all the relevant areas. You can always go back and repaint tiny details, and apply silver coats to the weapons. Applying shade involves using very thin, runny shades or inks to your mini. The main purpose of this is to introduce darker shades into the recess of the model, which will serve to make these details pop. Shades can be purchased or made by thinning paints and are typically darker to give the illusion of shadows around details. Once the base coat and shading are done, you can apply highlights. This is done by taking your detail or smaller base brush, loading paint onto it, and running the side of the brush, not the tip, along the hard edges of your mini. This will serve to pick out those edges and apply highlight to those edges and relevant regions, giving it a stylized, highlighted look. Typically, a highlight is lighter than the base coat. It's common to apply multiple layers of lighter highlights as well. Doing so will give your highlights a blending gradient with the base coat. 4. Batch paint for large numbers of similar minis. Batch painting is an efficient method to get through all of these minis in a very consistent method. The process of batch painting involves painting a single step on one mini, base coat, shade, highlight, and then immediately doing the same on the next mini. You apply this same step to all of the minis in the batch, and once they're all done, you can paint the next step on the first one. By the time you have done all of them, the first mini will be dried and ready for the next step. 3. Dry brush your mini for realistic-looking highlights. Dry brushing is an alternative method of highlighting your minis, and is arguably easier than standard highlighting. To dry brush, take your brush, remember, a brush specifically for dry brushing. You'll ruin your fine brushes doing this. Load up some paint onto it, and wipe off the excess onto a paper towel, making sure there is almost no paint left. Take your brush and lightly brush back and forth over the details you want to pick out. This will apply very small amounts of paint to all of the raised details of your model, which will give it a dusty, more realistic look. 2. Don't be afraid of mixing paints. You shouldn't be afraid of mixing your paints to achieve this. For this type of technique, a wet palette is a valuable tool. The moisture obtained by the palette makes mixing paints much easier. Another technique involving mixing paints is called wet blending, which involves taking another color of paint and mixing it onto another color that has been applied to result in a smooth transition. First, take a base color and apply it to your mini. While the paint is still wet, take another color and blend it along the boundary of the first color. The colors will mix and blend together, giving you a very smooth transition. This is an advanced technique, but you shouldn't be afraid to give it a try. Lastly, number 1. Use a fine tip marker for super tiny details. The final tip for painting minis doesn't involve paint or brushes at all. Instead, it uses a very fine tip marker, like a micron pen. These markers have a very fine tip capable of applying very fine details to your mini. These markers are super useful for adding minute details like eye pupils and writing on scrolls. Using markers eliminates the need for multiple coats, thinning your paints, or any other action that might result in messing up your precious paint job. If you liked our video, be sure to click like and subscribe for more HowExpert Top 10 videos for all topics from A to Z in the future. Also, let us know what other topics you want us to do a HowExpert Top 10 video in the future in the comments below. Thank you, have an amazing day, and take care. HowExpert publishes quick, how-to guides from all topics from A to Z by everyday experts. Visit HowExpert.com to learn more.